Hello, everyone, and welcome. Welcome to our Art History Festival. We're very happy that you joined us, and especially coming out on this gorgeous Friday evening. These are people who are you're really committed, and we're really happy that you're here to join us today. So this event, as I just mentioned, is a part of our Art History Festival. We have 90 events that are going on the whole week. It ends on Sunday. We're working with 80 partners all around the country, and we also have programs online. So we still have a full weekend coming ahead. If you have a look at our website at forarthistory.org.uk, and you can see some of the things that are going on for the next couple of days. So the theme of our festival is called Art History Local to Global. So we have a lot of organizations that are talking about the ties they have to their local communities and how they're relevant to them. And then we also have a lot of organizations, sometimes it's both, who are talking about international artists and artists from around the globe that they're presenting at their respective organizations. So it's a great mix of how institutions are relevant to their local communities, as well as bringing in all these perspectives from literally around the globe. And so that's why it's really fitting that Fatos is giving her talk tonight, because I'm sure that in her book, she has to deal with this idea of shifting demographics, of people's expectations of having different perspectives presented, and how institutions have to adjust to that. It's a different world, and I think you've set out a good model for how we can all deal with that in the sector. Before I introduce her, however, I do want to thank the National Gallery Trust and the Arts Council England for supporting our festival and making sure that it's free to everyone. So all of the events are free. And also I want to thank my colleague Christina Bradstreet here for organizing this mammoth event throughout the week, and my colleague Manahari Saravanamuthu, who does the press and marketing for the event as well. So Fatos is an independent curator, a writer working internationally. She was previously director of the Liverpool Biennial, director of the Roberts Institute of Art, associate curator of the 10th Gwangju Biennial in South Korea, and curator of free sculpture in 2023 and again this year in 2024. She's also curated London Art Night in 2017, and in 2015 she was the Art Fund curator for Figure 2, a groundbreaking project, and I still can't believe this, which presented 50 projects in 50 weeks. Over the last 10 years, Fatos has taken on multiple jury roles for national art prizes, including the Jindrich Chalupeki Award in 2022 to 2024, the Turner Prize in 2020, and the Celeste Prize in 2017. She's acted as an external member of the Acquisitions Committee for the Arts Council Collection from 2018 to 2020, and has nominated artists for the 4th Plinth and the Jarman Film Award. And she really is one of the important voices in curating today. So we're very pleased to have her, and please welcome Fatos Ustek.
Thank you, Greg. Thank you, Greg, for this wonderful introduction, and thank you, Christina, for the wonderful organization and for the invitation. I'm really delighted to see all of you here. As Greg has pronounced, it is a gorgeous weather out there, and it is a Friday evening, so this is like a double dip of luck for me. So as introduced, I have written this book. I don't know if who has read the book, actually, The Art Institution of Tomorrow. Amazing. One? One is great. Thank you, Ida. Perfect. It's an easy read. You just need a weekend or a long day. Oh, thank you. That's perfect. So the Art Institution of Tomorrow, Reinventing the Model, has been published this year in March by Land Humphreys in association with Sotheby's Institute of Art, and it's a part of their series called Hot Topics in the Art World. So indeed, it is a hot topic to think about institutions. And the reason that kind of prompted me to write this book is my observation coming from, the experience from the sector, and also exchange with my colleagues, is that art institutions are in crisis. but it is clouded by the fact that the world is in crisis, and we are really kind of like facing the crisis on all fronts. It's not only about the wars or the climate crisis, but also there's crisis in soil, health, energy, education, and so forth. So in this kind of like complex landscape of crises, the ontological crisis of what art institutions are for, who do they serve, what is their function, and what is their value, is also in a complex situation. And I think that kind of, let's say, confusion is leading art institutions to stagnate. So my kind of like grounding premise of the book is that art institutions are stagnating, and in different levels, at different scopes, and that's happening internationally. That's not only happening in the UK, which is specifically scarred by the Brexit and the pandemic, you know, and we can also go into the specificities of like, how can we get out of this? But one thing that I've been observing in the sector is that we are, at the moment, because there is a kind of a continuous bombardment of demands for institutions to respond, for institutions to take a political stance, for institutions to be resourceful, to be inclusive, to be diverse, to be accessible, to be equitable, to kind of like accommodate needs of the, let's say, communities near and far. There is a lot of turmoil that is induced. So there's kind of like, let's say, a mountain of external pressures that institutions are grappling with, but also another mountain of internal problems that is, you know, really fueled by the precarity of our sector as well. Like, we are really working, functioning in a precarious sector, not only because of the, you know, like bad pay, but also, you know, like unfair working conditions or contractual relationships or representation, etc., etc. So what I've been looking at is that instead of observing the kind of like, let's say, instinctive, quick fix solutions, what could be done? And I am sorry to break the news, but we do need a radical systemic change. It is the structure that the institutions are run and the kind of like the business model that we've inherited, the lineage of dependency on power, and that power was by the stakeholders, let that be individual people, the philanthropists, or the state, or the governments, or the funding bodies, or, you know, the community, so on and so forth. It is really crunching institutions into not knowing what is it that they need to do. And I think one thing that is very important, and those are kind of like two key notions in the book, is that how could we embed institutions with agency and autonomy, and especially financial autonomy? Because once art institutions have agency and autonomy, then they will be able to make the choices that they make, that they will find the grounds in which they will be resourceful and also relevant for artists as well as a wider community of audiences and the public at large. So this is kind of like a brief introduction, and I want to actually do something a bit different. Because I've been doing a lot of presentation since the book has been out, and this is actually my second time. The first time was at the ICA in March when the book was launched, and I kind of like traveled around the world, and I'm back in London again. So I want to do something different, because I think this is a very important special crowd. You know, you're all interested in art, and then I believe that there are art historians among us, lecturers, or people, creative practitioners who are devoted to art, and maybe artists. So what I want to do is actually, I would love you to ask me questions. I can talk to you about my methodology, I can talk to you about like the contents of the book, I can talk to you about the model. But I don't want to do it as kind of like talking at you, but let's reverse this, because we're still a small group of people, and let's do this in conversation. Is that okay? So no Q&A, we just started now. So who wants to ask the first question?
So I was just really interested in the central thesis that you explained around that kind of the idea of stagnation within arts institutions, and just unpacking a little bit more about exactly what that means and what it doesn't mean, please.
With pleasure. So, for instance, to understand stagnation, maybe we need to look at the manifestations of it. You know, like what does it appear as? And one strand is the programming. I do observe that in many institutions, it's not necessarily specific to the UK, there's a big tendency, and also especially Europe and the US, there's a big tendency of measuring success through ticket sales. and through kind of, let's say, the quantitative outreach of the programming. And what happens is that because of that goal, there is a lot of programming that is either populist or very mainstream, or in a way kind of like ends up in an eco tunnel of showcasing the same names over and over again in the same manner. So when we are talking about, let's say, more inclusive and more varied perspectives to be part of the, let's say, rooster of an institution, then it kind of like stagnates to do so. The other thing is a financial stagnation, because of the fact that like many institutions in the world, not specific to the UK, are grappling with the economic crisis, even though it's not announced as financial crisis as of yet, but we are really living one, you know, like look at the inflation rates. There is also a kind of a scarcity in resources. I mean, let's look at the UK in its specific. You know, there is a huge pressure from the government on art institutions to, you know, like transform from public subsidy-based income model to a mixed income model, where many institutions are today asked to kind of like diversify their income streams, let alone increase the income that they receive from private sources. I mean, we also see that with, let's say, local authorities either going bankrupt or overnight deciding not to fund institutions. Look at, you know, Birmingham, look at Eastbourne, etc. So what is happening here is then, like there's, again, the kind of reference to the quick fix, then the institutions need to find a way to sustain themselves. How can they do that? Maybe they go for funding opportunities that actually have strings attached. So there is a certain level of expectation from the funding body for the institution to do that informs their programming, that informs their direction of travel. And for me, that is also stagnation, that the institution doesn't make an autonomous or initiative taking into their programming, but they're really tied to what the funding bodies require and deliver to the demands of the exterior forces. That is also stagnation, and this can go on and on. Yeah. No problem. Any second question? Nick? Yeah? And then we'll come to you. Yeah. Who's Nick?
Thinking about institutions, isn't it in the nature of institutions to stagnate just by their nature? I mean, how long have we had institutions in this society? It's very different from societies that existed before. Can we take it for granted that institutions are the best structural device for culture? And it seems to me, looking at them and looking at the history of them, that they just become bigger and more institutionalized as things go on. And I work, and as probably most people here, I work in an institution. So it's very hard for me to see a way that an institution can reverse that process, which is one of increasing sclerotic patterns of behavior.
That's a brilliant question, and I totally agree with you. And what has happened over the last couple of decades is that institutions, art institutions, because culture is now part of a creative industry, it was not. And also there is a kind of like a market association to culture today, you know, like we kind of like measure that with GDA and then how much money it kind of contributes to the overall annual income of the country, etc. So this is a really good question, because I think one of the reasons for stagnation is that institutions became obsessed to institute themselves. You know, like they became more like self-referential, self-reflexive structures. And from that moment, you actually kind of like cut your ties with what is happening elsewhere. And two things I want to say. One is like my first chapter focuses on the core purpose and reinstating core purpose for institutions so that they step aside from instituting themselves. We can go deeper into that. The other thing is there is a book that has really informed my research. I've done, like my methodology has been twofold. So I've been looking into the sector and looking at like what are the examples of excellence that is happening today globally. And I held interviews with people, directors of institutions from the Metropolitan Museum to the Mori Art Museum or Yogyakarta Biennial, etc., or Whitechapel Gallery. And for me, it was very important to kind of like understand how, as a sector, we're building micro resilience to this, like situation. But also, I've looked at theories of 21st century economics. What is the mindset that we need to employ as the, like individuals of the 21st century? We can no longer be in that degenerative economy mindset. Degenerative economy is a term from economy. It's not degenerative art, which we know from the, like Second World War narrative, but degenerative economy's logic is about how can you derive the biggest surplus from the smallest input of resource. So precarity of working conditions is part of that degenerative economy. Like we get really small salaries and now we're expected to work long hours and they kind of like put a lot of effort into making things happen. It can also be that, like we don't pay artists. That is part of that degenerative economy mindset. But looking into the 21st century understanding of economy, we need to recognize that we have limited resources. And those resources are not only the materials, like, let's say energy, oil, materials in the earth, but also resources that we produce knowledge with, resources that we produce infrastructure with. So with that new awareness, we need to build a structure, a mindset that is regenerative, that is beyond upcycling, that is beyond recycling. How can we kind of like build a distribution of resources and their transformation so that we can kind of like build a much more kind of, let's say, coherent basis for our current condition. So, and then the other thing I looked at was sociology of organizations. There is a book I really recommend everyone to read. It is by a French sociologist called Frédéric Laloux. And he wrote this book, Reinventing Organizations. Looked at the evolutionary stages of humankind and how, also like there's a referential book for Frédéric Laloux as well as John Gebser's The Origin, or Ever Origin, sorry. And where John Gebser looks at the 5 consciousness states of humanity, from archaic, mythical, magical, etc. But what Frédéric Laloux suggests is that because of these different stages of our consciousness, we have built different forms of organization. I'll just give you a brief intro to the book because it is quite brilliant and it's very easy to read. So what he does is like he kind of looks at how humanity has been organizing themselves from the start of the first collaboration. That could be passing a stone to kill a fish, to like building a dwelling. And then he kind of like looks at the, let's say, the dichotomy of the parallelism between each evolutionary stage resulting in a new formation of an organization. So for instance, he kind of like calls them into paradigms. So the red paradigm, and he uses the color spectrum of the rainbow. So the red paradigm is, for instance, the mafia. There was one person at the top, and then all the other people were kind of like subjected to that person. It was high torture, high violence. And when the person on the top, turned around, they would be killed, and then someone would rise, but it was still the same structure. And then there's the amber paradigm, which is like the Catholic Church. There's like stratification of castes and roles. However, it was still very rigid and strong, and it was very hard to kind of like move. And then there is the green and the orange and the green paradigm, etc. So one thing that, coming back to your question, Nick, on a very long-winded route, is that I think we do need our organizations, because what has happened, if you look at the history of organizational frameworks and infrastructures, that organizations have helped humanity to progress and to innovate. But, they also can fall obsolete. And I do believe that, and that is very important in the book as well, that we are actually on the brink of a paradigm shift. And it already started. Our society is already very different. Our needs is very different. We live in a heterogeneous society. Look at the, profile of audiences here now. It's no longer a homogeneous society that can kind of like sustain this idea of a nation state. It is actually a society with multiple different needs and multiple expectations. And sometimes they can be aligned and sometimes they can be contradicting. So if we are already in this paradigm shift, when do we know it has happened is retrospectively. So I think we're already, you know, like kind of like merging into like this tectonic plates that drift into each other. We are already merging into a new paradigm shift, and that is going to be more collective, less competitive, perhaps less individualistic, and more, it won't be about being I'm right, it will be about saying yes together, you know? So in that sense, and I will, you know, end my answer to you is that I do think we do need institutions, but we do need institutions that are non-self-reflexive, that are actually learning organizations, and that's my second chapter. I do bring a more active engagement to the institution. We are in that paradigm shift. We are really in that new framework, a new mindset where art institutions can no longer be cultural authorities. They could be 2 centuries ago, because visual culture was really defined by what was brought to the masses and the forces in the, you know, like in the forces of civilization of the masses or educating them. But today, visual culture is a wider, bigger domain, and visual arts is only a subset of it. So in that regard, we need to kind of like really think and reframe that cultural authority role of like holding the knowledge, having the, you know, like kind of like a authority to claim and to set the direction. We need to move to a position that is defined by cultural humility and more porosity, etc. Yes, we have that one. And yeah. Yes, please. I'll drink some water.
I was just wondering if you thought that this stagnation and fracturing is also happening at the level of audiences, not just because they're suffering the same financial precarity as institutions, but also for cultural reasons such as all of those lockdowns changing people's habits. So now you'll have a much bigger audience for an online version of an event rather than showing up. So the programming is becoming very populist in order to sort of counteract that, because those are reliable ticket sales.
I think this is like a very important question, but I feel like you have like multiple questions in here. So let's unpack that together. I think first of all, of course, you know, like there is a shift of balances between the public and the institution today, and we could give examples of also like what's been happening in the political arena, you know, from the Russia-Ukraine war to also what's happening in Palestine and Israel, and how it has already divided audiences to certain institutions, let alone the kind of, let's say, the force of the cancel culture is also really impacting institutions. And we can also perhaps like dive deeper into what does it mean, you know, for art institutions today to hold a stance, or should they hold a stance, and if so, what stance that should be. So that is one thing that is kind of like really fracturing the audiences. The other thing is that, I mean, I will talk in the specificity of the UK, but we can also look at what's happening in Germany or what's happening in Poland or Indonesia. In the UK, you know, like Arts Council England changed their policy, the 10-year policy, and there's no more grade that is associated with art, and there is no more art, it's just less create. So that kind of like building a domain of creativity that is wide and encompassing, but that perhaps like kind of like push the kilter so much that I do talk a lot, and that is a polemical part in my book, about community-centric programming and the programming of social practice. Because social practice is something that has been, you know, rising since the 90s. Of course, like biennials have been really important forefront exhibitions that kind of like started the avant-garde in contemporary art, showcasing, you know, like artists that are really politically active or wanting to also mark a social shift into the, you know, like understanding of the world around us. However, community-centric practice, and I kind of like see that a lot in the UK as well, is now interpreted as like identifying a community through their defining features. And I mean, now it's all recorded, but I do think that it has close tendencies of colonialism as well, even though is that extractive approach is done through not resources, but through identifying and categorizing people, and also projecting onto what those categorizations might need. And I find that really problematic. I think, like, for instance, we're all here today because you are, I think, interested in thinking about institutions, or you have an interest in art history, and I think that is quite an important force to kind of like bring communities together that are not defined by their visible or invisible characteristics, but also through their common shared interests and excitements. And last point into your question is the digital. So, and that's also like something I address on my 4th chapter, because I'm also connecting that to the business model, a new business model idea. I mean, we all have to accept that the future is phygital. You know, this concept that was actually initially, the term that was initially coined by an advertisement consultant. I think, please correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it was around like 2015 or so. And phygital is like physical and digital together. So we, as institutions, also really need to kind of understand and embrace what it means. You know, like, again, you know, there was almost like a outpour of content onto the online platforms, especially during the lockdowns. But how many of you really had a profound engagement with these online shows? Besides, for myself, you know, I was so tired of, like, you know, moving my mouse from one kind of like wall to see a kind of like an image flat on another virtual wall that could have been better presented on a PDF. You know, so we kind of like perhaps, and this is something, a critique I bring to the institutions as well, we need to kind of like start building the language of the digital into the institutional frameworks and really treat it as a language. Like, when you excel in a language, you can, you know, like build metaphors, you can build symbolisms, you can write poetry. And I think at the moment with digital, we're doing translations, and that is literally so direct, so one-to-one, that it actually fails to kind of like fulfill its premise or promise. Yeah. Thank you. Okay. Yes. Okay. Yes, after you. Yeah.
I mean, it's good that you mentioned Jogja in Indonesia already. I just want to know, how do you see institution in developing countries like Indonesia? I mean, maybe you've been to Jogja Art Festival, right? So how important is the ministry is under Creative Industry Ministry, and then there's a Cultural Affairs Director General, and then also, I assume, the galleries in Jogja is also quite important in art scene there in Jogja. And I think one of the group is curating even German Art Festival, I think 2 years ago or something. Anyway, I just want to know.
Ruan Grupa, you mean the documentary?
That's the one.
Yes,
Yeah, that's the one. So I just want to know, what's the differences, characteristic of developing countries, institutions, especially Indonesia?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you so much. I think Indonesia, among the developing countries, has actually quite an interesting infrastructure already. As you rightfully said, there is a strong support of the private individuals, you know, not only kind of like supporting galleries, but also at the same time supporting the biennial. I had the pleasure of interviewing Alia Swastika, who is the artistic director of Yogyakarta Biennial for many years. And that one thing that was very important was about, okay, when we build structures, how do we build sustainability into it? Because something that we see a lot in developing countries is that those structures can be fragile. Like those collectors who support galleries or who have collections can decide overnight not to do so. Where, you know, again, in Indonesia specifically, the government has a different role and a different expectation from culture. And I think that is more that translation of tourism. You know, how can you translate that cultural tourism into cash coming into the country? And that framework is, again, a transactional framework. But if we really want to kind of cultivate interesting, creative grounds, we need to perhaps like go beyond that transactional relationships. And that happens for members of or institutions as well. Like when you're a member, are you a member because like it's cheaper to get the membership than buying 2 tickets a year and 10% off in the cafe, or are you a member because you really align with the ethos of the organization and its values and you really want to kind of like support, even though some of the programming you dislike?
So I guess my question is there stagnation institution in developing countries, such as Indonesia?
I think like there, the stagnation is more about the precarity of that and sustainability. Like I also interviewed colleagues in China, like there was a huge boom of like museums in China, and now they're closing left and right because they were also part of that governmental scheme, and there were all these like different benefits that people could derive from. Either you were a real estate developer and you would start a museum and afterwards kind of like build gated communities around it and make a huge income or profit from that interaction and close the museum. So one thing that is happening is that, like how can we create a cultural legacy? I don't think everything needs to be permanent. However, I think this kind of like fluctuating ground and uncertainty is really destructive for a scene. I'm from Turkey, and we have, there has never been a public support, from the, let's say, initial museums. Like we only had like a painting and sculpture museum, and that was closed for 30 years while I was living in Turkey, and now it's reopened. And that the state funding is non-existent, and it was always private funding, and in the 90s it was the banks that started supporting art institutions, or let's say non-collecting art galleries. And then now there's like actually 5, 6 very rich families who kind of like are the patrons of the arts and culture in Istanbul or in Turkey. And what happens is that there are some collectors, they open a gallery and then they participate in big international fairs like Frieze, or they go to Armory and things like that. And then overnight they might just like say, I'm bored, I won't do it anymore. But I think we need to build some form of responsibility and accountability into these initiatives so that even though those collectors don't want to continue, those artists are not like left aside. Or we even had a situation in Turkey where the gallery was going bankrupt, and it sold the gallery with all the artists represented in it, like a football team, to some other people, so these kind of like movements, I think we need to be much more aware of them, and let alone maybe try to prevent them from happening in some form or way that, that is legislative, or that is, like a social consensus, etc. Thank you. There's, yes, you, and then you, and then you, and then you. Okay, perfect. How long do I have?
About 10 minutes.
Oh, perfect.
Sorry. Thank you so much. I think that, at the beginning, one of the first things you said was around having a paradigm shift. And you've mentioned how this sort of is happening, pardon for a better metaphor, but a kind of like sandwich level. So at institutional level, you mentioned ACE and the funding system, but also having this kind of like going against institutionalized institutions, so this grassroots movement. And I was wondering, especially looking I think that you've mentioned funding quite a lot, and a lot of the visions of a more collective, less competitive vision. And I was wondering, in terms of that, how does that paradigm shift look like? And instead, in terms of a grassroots level, how can we do that without falling into extractive kind of dynamics?
Yeah, brilliant question. Thank you so much. So I think the change will need to happen on both directions. A couple of things, like in the book, I'm focusing on institutions that are medium to large and extra large scale. Because if we kind of imagine change happening, we need that to also take place in that level. So that it's because I think small and micro scale organizations are already very agile. They have small teams and they can really shift the direction and build much more resilience into their organization, shrink and grow. But it's harder to kind of shift the Titanic. So that is one thing that is very important. And the other thing, and that's a key term, is I do believe that the systems and structures we are moving towards is going to be more and more decentralized, if possible, distributed. And I've been looking at also like organizations that are functioning in tech area as startups, etc. And there is a term called distributed intelligence. And it is about like how do you actually engage everyone who is working in that institution, and how do you actually tap into that intelligence that everyone in the organization becomes a sensor. Here we are actually working very much with this inherited, 18th century inherited pyramidic schemes. I think they're obsolete. They no longer fit. So one of the other kind of like radical suggestions that I have in my book is demolishing departments and also starting cross-skilled teams that work together in delivering projects, managing their budgets, managing their timelines, embedding more agency and initiative taking to everyone in the organization. Of course, I'm not saying that, you know, like levels of experience is not important. It is very important. But in this environment, once the organization really becomes a learning organization, this learning is also embedded into cross-learning from one another, and everyone bringing their own disciplines and kind of like perspectives to the common cause. So that distributedness can be scaled up in a country level, in a city level, in a town level, in a neighborhood level, you know, in the sense that it was actually something like a tangible example, you know, like for instance, Art Council England. I don't know if you are familiar with, you know, national portfolio organizations, but there are 4 investment principles, and as an organization, you need to kind of like fulfill certain expectations. There are certain metrics and really lengthy reporting. Yes. Delightful. So I am suggesting that instead of every organization trying to fit into that expectation of the Arts Council, what if that, let's say, desired goal of, you know, fitting all those metrics, engaging all those different people from different backgrounds and interest areas and needs of accessibility, so on and so forth, is done collectively. So we make it into a puzzle. So we actually distribute the intelligence across the country, across the city, across the town, across the neighborhood, in the sense that it's not about all of us trying to kind of like pass that threshold of achievement, but actually, you know, one organization contributes 20% to the dynamism and then 10% of the environmental principle, et cetera, et cetera. What if we actually build something that way instead of, you know, like a competitive background, competitive environment where already the resources are scarce and we are kind of fighting to get it with each other. Yeah. See, I talk a lot. So, okay, can we do 1.5? Okay, I'll do one and then you last. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. I was going to ask what the ideal model was, but I feel like you've just described it. So I was just going to ask, are there any art institutions of tomorrow that you think are actually operating in this way today? I mean, in the European sort of UK context, you think about an institution like the Royal Academy, which is big and could be like trying to move the Titanic, but it's not funded by the Arts Council, it's independent, it's run by artists. Like, is there any institution that's operating now that you think is at least close to your ideal art institute of tomorrow?
So there are, but different models are kind of like, how can I say, there isn't an institution that is fully operating in the model that I suggest. I actually want to start that, and I don't want to start on my own, but with people. So I don't want to be the only director. I actually want to do it with other like-minded people coming from different skill sets and really create that cross-sectional learning for us and then for everyone. But for instance, with the RA model, you know, like they're very much dependent on the philanthropy, and that philanthropic base is very much dependent on privilege and status. And I do suggest that we need to kind of like redefine power today. What is power? And 20th century of definition of power is perhaps like to have the force to make others do what you want. And perhaps 21st century definition of power needs to be the ability to anticipate the needs of others and to be able to provide it for them. And if we could kind of like make that switch, we will also need to kind of make a switch of what is status? Can we build an understanding of status not based on dominance, virtue, and success, but through, again, this kind of like elevating a practice of yourself and others together. And I think that will be like major shifts. And as soon as you kind of like build a support network, and because that's my business model idea, that is non-hierarchical distributed income model, and as long as you can build that work that is not seeking privilege and status, but actually kind of like aligned with your ethos and with your values, you will be able to build this institution and also build sustainability into its kind of continuity. Thank you. One more question and I am off the stage.
Hi, thank you. I was just wondering, as an art lawyer and interested, of course, in the art market, I wanted to hear or to listen to your perspective, considering the shifts that you've anticipated in technology and institutions. How do you envision their relationships and their legal frameworks with creators, institutions, and specifically for the artist rights?
I mean, this is like a really big topic. It's incredible. Thank you so much for asking this. I will give you an example. I don't know if you know Frank, Fair Artist Pay. It is an initiative that I started with 2 artists in 2021, with Anne Hardy and Lindsay Sears. And Frank Artist Pay, we also have a law firm that is one of our founding members. We have 5 founding members. And the whole idea is we are working towards building transparency and clarity to the relationship between the artists and commissioning bodies. That could be art institutions, commercial galleries, local councils, etc. And I think that legal frameworks will be very important. What we're trying to do is like to kind of outline the steps that it takes for an artist's professional engagement with a commission or showcasing existing work, adapting work, etc. And we're also like building these pre-contractual reviews that really unpack also what are those contractual stages. How could they become even more transparent and more clear so that before the start of a relationship, there is a clear set of expectations and needs are mapped onto the paper so that it brings also more fair practice to the way people collaborate. And I think this will be very, very important. Like fair practice is going to be one of the key pillars of our society, because that also is about the inclusivity, diversity, accessibility, and equitability principle. Economic parity is part of the equation, and if we take that out, we actually are also kind of like only serving a certain class and a certain income level. My pleasure. Become a member of Frank. Thank you. Thank you so much. I hope you enjoyed this interactive lecture. Thank you.
I think it worked.
Yeah.
That worked really well. Thank you. I should mention, if you go to the Eventbrite site where you booked your tickets for this, there is a 10% discount on Fatos's book that you can take advantage of. And I mentioned that she's the curator of Frieze Sculpture. She's going to be giving, as part of the festival, she's going to be giving a tour at 2 o'clock on Sunday. There are a few tickets left. For that, again, it's free like everything else. So if you want to hear her talking about the sculpture that she's curated at Frieze, do come then. She's also going to be staying for the Zach Ove talk, so you have more of a chance to chat with her after this. So we'll see you in a little bit, and otherwise, people who are going can go out that door. Thank you very much for coming. Thank you.